Have you ever felt someone slowly disappearing from your life while still technically being there? Not gone, not broken up, just distant. You read their messages and something feels different. The warmth is missing. The curiosity is gone. And suddenly you start asking yourself questions you never wanted to ask. Did they stop loving me? Did I do something wrong? Or worse, are they already emotionally gone? If you've ever loved someone with an avoidant personality, you know this feeling too well. The slow fading, the quiet detachment, the invisible wall that seems to appear overnight. One day they were close, open, connected. Then something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just subtly, and that subtle shift is what confuses people the most. Because avoidant people rarely leave relationships in obvious ways. They don't always scream. They don't always argue. They don't always say goodbye. Instead, they do something far more painful. They slowly remove their emotional presence. You might still see their name on your phone, but the person you once felt connected to feels strangely absent. Psychologists call this emotional withdrawal, and it happens long before the relationship officially ends. At first, the signs are almost impossible to see. Replies get shorter. Conversations feel forced. The deep talks you used to have slowly disappear. You start sharing something important, and their response feels distant, flat, almost polite, like you're talking to someone who is listening, but not really there. And this is where the confusion begins, because nothing is clearly wrong. There's no dramatic fight, no final conversation, no clear moment where things ended, just a growing silence between two people who once felt close. This silence can make you question everything. You replay old conversations in your head. You wonder if you said something wrong. You search for the exact moment things changed. But the truth is, the change often happens inside their mind, long before it appears in their behavior. Avoidant people have a very specific way of protecting themselves when emotional closeness starts to feel overwhelming. They don't confront the feeling. They don't talk through the fear. They slowly disconnect from it. It's not always intentional. In many cases, they don't even realize they're doing it. Their mind simply starts creating distance, less vulnerability, less emotional exposure, less attachment, and the person on the other side of that distance feels the shift immediately. Because humans are incredibly sensitive to emotional presence. You can feel when someone is truly with you, and you can feel when they are slowly leaving. The painful part is that many people respond to this shift in the same way. They try harder. They send longer messages. They attempt deeper conversations. They try to pull the closeness back. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional pressure often has the opposite effect. Instead of bringing them closer, it pushes them further away, and this creates one of the most painful emotional dynamics a person can experience. The more you try to reconnect, the more they withdraw. The more you show your need, the more they feel overwhelmed, until eventually you find yourself holding on to a connection that feels very different from the one you started with. And deep down, a quiet fear begins to grow. A fear that maybe the relationship is already ending, even if nobody has said it out loud yet. Because when an avoidant begins emotionally detaching, the process rarely happens in a single moment. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. But once it begins, the emotional distance can grow in ways that are very difficult to reverse. And the hardest part of all is that most people don't realize what's really happening until the connection has already started slipping away. And this is the moment where most people start fighting for the connection. Not because they are weak, because they care, because the bond once felt real. So you try to bring things back to how they used to be. You send thoughtful messages. You try to reopen deeper conversations. You remind them of the memories you shared. You hope something will spark again. But something strange begins to happen. Instead of pulling them closer, your effort seems to push them further away. The warmth doesn't return. The energy doesn't shift. And the more you reach for them, the more distant they seem. This is the confusing part of dealing with someone who has strong avoidant tendencies. Their mind interprets emotional intensity differently. What feels like love to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like connection to you can feel like loss of freedom to them. So their instinct isn't to move closer. Their instinct is to create space. Sometimes that space shows up as silence. Sometimes it appears as emotional flatness. Sometimes it feels like they are physically present but mentally somewhere else. You can sit next to them and still feel alone. You can speak to them and feel like your words are bouncing off a wall. And this creates a painful cycle inside your mind. You start wondering if trying harder will fix it. Maybe if you explain your feelings more clearly. Maybe if you become more patient. Maybe if you give them exactly what they need. So you analyze every interaction. You reread old messages. You search for clues. You look for signs that the connection is still alive somewhere beneath the surface. Because the human mind hates uncertainty. It wants answers. It wants reassurance. It wants something solid to hold on to. But avoidant detachment rarely gives clear answers. It creates fog, emotional fog. And inside that fog, people often blame themselves. They wonder if they asked for too much, if they moved too fast, if they expected too much closeness. But the truth is far more complex than that. Avoidant patterns often develop long before you ever entered their life. These patterns are not about a single conversation. They are not about one mistake. They are survival strategies built over years, sometimes decades. When emotional closeness begins to feel overwhelming, their brain searches for safety. And safety in their mind often means distance. Distance from vulnerability. Distance from emotional dependence. Distance from the risk of being hurt. So the mind begins to rewrite the story of the relationship. It starts focusing on flaws. Small problems suddenly feel bigger. Moments of conflict feel more significant. The mind quietly builds a narrative that justifies pulling away, not because the connection was meaningless, but because detaching feels easier than facing the fear of intimacy. And once that mental shift begins, something very important starts to change. Their emotional investment slowly decreases. The urgency to fix problems disappears. The desire to reconnect weakens. Where there was once effort, there is now passivity. Where there was once curiosity, there is now distance. And this shift can feel devastating when you are the one experiencing it. Because you remember who they used to be with you. You remember the laughter, the late conversations, the feeling that you mattered deeply to them. So your mind keeps asking the same question again and again. Where did that person go? But the reality is often harder to accept. The person didn't disappear overnight. They slowly turned down the emotional volume inside themselves, step by step, feeling by feeling, until the connection no longer carried the same intensity it once did. And when someone reaches that level of detachment, the relationship begins standing on fragile ground, not because love was never there, but because the emotional distance has grown wider than most people realize. And once that gap becomes too large, closing it requires something very rare, a willingness from both sides to face discomfort, to face fear, to face vulnerability. And if that willingness isn't there, the silence between two people can grow so wide that even the strongest memories struggle to bridge it. And when that emotional gap grows wide enough, something inside you begins to panic. Not loudly, quietly. It shows up in small moments. You check your phone more often. You reread their last message. You wonder why their tone feels colder. Your mind begins searching for reassurance. One clear sign that everything is still okay. But reassurance rarely comes. And the silence begins to speak louder than words ever did. Because deep down you can feel it. Something inside the connection is fading. The effort that once flowed naturally now feels forced. The warmth that once felt effortless now feels distant. And the hardest part is this. You are still emotionally present, still invested, still hoping, but they are slowly stepping away from that same emotional space. This is where many people make a mistake that feels natural but changes everything. They start chasing the old version of the relationship. They try to recreate what once felt easy. They bring up memories. They try to reignite the closeness. But the avoidant mind often interprets this differently, not as love, not as commitment, but as pressure. Pressure to feel something they are already trying to suppress. Pressure to return to a level of emotional closeness that now feels uncomfortable. And when avoidants feel pressure, their mind goes into protection mode. Distance increases. Conversations become shorter. The emotional door begins closing even further. You might notice something subtle but powerful. They stop sharing personal thoughts. They stop asking about your feelings. They respond politely, but the emotional depth is gone. It feels like talking to someone who is being careful not to step too close. And this is one of the clearest signals that the emotional shift has already happened inside them. Because when someone truly wants to stay connected, curiosity remains, interest remains, effort remains. But when detachment takes over, those things slowly disappear, and the silence between messages starts to feel heavier, longer, more permanent. At first, you tell yourself they just need space. Then you tell yourself things will return to normal soon. But time passes, and the distance doesn't shrink. It grows, and the human heart struggles with that kind of uncertainty, because hope can keep a person waiting far longer than they should. Hope whispers that things will change tomorrow. Hope says they just need more time. Hope convinces you to ignore what your instincts are already telling you. But instincts rarely lie. When emotional presence disappears, your mind feels it long before logic catches up. You notice it in the way conversations end quickly. You notice it in the lack of enthusiasm. You notice it in the absence of effort. And eventually, a quiet realization begins forming inside you. You are holding on to something that no longer feels mutual. You are trying to maintain a connection that only one person is actively protecting. And that realization can be painful, because letting go of the idea of what the relationship once was feels like losing something meaningful. But there is another truth hiding inside this moment, a truth many people only see after they stop chasing. Real connection cannot survive on one person's effort. It cannot thrive when one heart is reaching forward while the other is slowly stepping back. Love requires presence. It requires emotional availability. It requires two people who are willing to stay engaged, even when things become uncomfortable. And when someone repeatedly chooses distance instead of connection, they are revealing something important, not just about the relationship, but about their capacity for closeness at this moment in their life. Understanding this doesn't instantly remove the pain, but it changes the way you see the situation. Because instead of asking why you weren't enough, you begin asking a more powerful question. Why were you fighting so hard for someone who was slowly letting go? And once that question takes root inside your mind, something begins to shift. Your focus slowly turns away from chasing their attention and begins turning back toward your own worth. And the moment your focus begins to return to your own worth, something powerful starts to happen inside you. The fog begins to lift. The confusion starts losing its grip. Because for so long, your mind was trapped in one exhausting loop, trying to understand them, trying to decode their behavior, trying to solve a puzzle that was never yours to solve. You kept searching for the exact message that would bring them back, the exact words that would make them feel safe enough to return. But slowly, a deeper realization begins to settle in. You cannot convince someone to value closeness if closeness is the very thing they fear. You cannot force emotional presence from someone who has already started shutting that door inside themselves. And once you truly understand that, something inside you begins to shift. The energy that once went toward chasing begins turning inward. You start noticing how much effort you are giving, how much patience you are offering, how much emotional space you were holding. And suddenly you see something clearly that was invisible before. You were showing up fully. You were willing to connect. You were willing to communicate. You were willing to stay present even when things became uncomfortable. That kind of emotional courage is not weakness. It is strength. But when that strength is directed towards someone who keeps stepping back, it slowly drains you. It leaves you feeling like you are fighting alone for something that requires two people. And the truth is simple, even if it is difficult to accept. Relationships cannot survive on potential. They survive on participation, on mutual effort, on two people choosing the connection again and again, even when life becomes complicated. When someone repeatedly withdraws instead of engaging, they are revealing something through their actions, not through dramatic words, through consistent distance. And distance, when repeated long enough, becomes a decision, a quiet decision to remain emotionally unavailable. Understanding this can feel painful at first, because it forces you to release the fantasy that things might suddenly return to how they once were. But inside that painful realization is a powerful form of freedom. Freedom from chasing. Freedom from constant uncertainty. Freedom from trying to earn attention that should be given willingly. And this is where your real power begins. Not in convincing someone to stay, but in recognizing when someone has stopped showing up. Because when you stop pouring your energy into someone who is emotionally stepping away, something unexpected happens. Your clarity grows stronger. Your self-respect becomes louder. You begin remembering what healthy connection actually feels like. It feels mutual. It feels responsive. It feels like two people meeting each other halfway instead of one person running while the other chases. And once you experience that kind of balance, something inside you changes permanently. You stop settling for emotional crumbs. You stop convincing yourself that distance means depth. You stop mistaking confusion for passion, because real connection does not leave you constantly guessing where you stand. It does not require endless emotional decoding. It does not make you feel like you must fight for the smallest amount of attention. Real connection feels steady. It feels safe. It feels like someone choosing you without hesitation. And when you begin expecting that level of presence in your life, something extraordinary happens. The people who thrive on emotional distance slowly lose their hold over you. Their silence stops controlling your thoughts. Their absence stops defining your worth. And the space they leave behind becomes something valuable, not emptiness. Opportunity. Opportunity for connections that are honest. Opportunity for relationships where closeness is not treated like a threat. Opportunity for love that grows stronger through openness instead of retreat. The moment you stop chasing someone who has emotionally stepped away is the moment you begin stepping towards something healthier, something more stable, something real. And that shift begins with one powerful decision: choosing yourself with the same intensity you once used, trying to hold the connection together. And the moment you truly choose yourself, the entire story begins to change, not because the past suddenly disappears, but because your role in it transforms. For so long, your energy was focused outward, watching their behavior, waiting for their messages, measuring every small sign of attention like it meant everything. Your emotional world revolved around someone who was slowly stepping away. But the moment you stop chasing, the center of gravity shifts. Your attention comes back to you. Your time becomes yours again. Your thoughts stop orbiting around someone who is emotionally unavailable. And at first, that shift feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because letting go of the chase creates silence. A silence where there used to be constant wondering. But inside that silence, something powerful begins to grow. Clarity. You start seeing the relationship from a different angle. You remember the times you ignored your own needs just to keep the connection alive. You remember the moments when your intuition whispered that something wasn't right, but you pushed those feelings aside because you cared, because you believed patience and love could fix anything. Yet the truth slowly becomes undeniable. Love cannot thrive where effort only moves in one direction. Love cannot grow where emotional walls keep rising higher. And most importantly, love cannot survive when one person is always trying to prove their worth. Because real connection never requires you to beg for presence. It never forces you to shrink your needs just to keep someone comfortable. It never makes you feel like loving deeply is a mistake. When someone is capable of real emotional closeness, your care does not scare them. Your openness does not overwhelm them. Your presence does not feel like pressure. Instead, it feels like home. And once you begin understanding this difference, your standards begin to rise, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. You stop romanticizing emotional distance. You stop telling yourself that inconsistency is mysterious or exciting. You stop calling confusion a deep connection, because clarity becomes more valuable than uncertainty. Stability becomes more attractive than emotional chaos. And the more you step into that clarity, the less power avoidant behavior has over your life. Their silence no longer feels like a puzzle you must solve. Their distance no longer feels like a reflection of your worth. It simply becomes information about what they are capable of giving, and more importantly, what they are not. This realization changes the way you move forward. You become more selective with your energy, more protective of your emotional space, more aware of the difference between someone who is curious about you and someone who is slowly pulling away. Because once you have experienced the pain of emotional withdrawal, you begin recognizing the early signs faster. You notice when effort is one-sided. You notice when conversations feel empty. You notice when someone keeps you close enough to stay interested, but far enough to avoid true intimacy. And instead of trying harder, you begin doing something far more powerful. You step back, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. You refuse to compete for attention. You refuse to chase someone who is unsure about your place in their life. And in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Your value stops being measured by their response. It becomes defined by your standards, your boundaries, your willingness to walk away from anything that requires you to abandon yourself. Because the truth is this: the right connection will never require you to lose your dignity just to keep it alive. The right person will not slowly disappear while you fight to hold the relationship together. They will meet you with the same effort, the same curiosity, the same emotional presence. And once you understand that, something inside you becomes unshakable. You stop chasing people who are unsure. You stop settling for half-hearted connection. You stop waiting for someone to realize your worth. Because the moment you truly recognize it yourself, everything about the way you love begins to change. Because the moment your standards rise, something inside you becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to see people for who they truly are, not who you hoped they would become, not who they were in the beginning, but who they consistently show themselves to be. And that kind of clarity is powerful. It breaks illusions. It ends the endless guessing. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of trying to fix someone who never asked to be fixed. For so long, your heart believed that patience could heal distance, that understanding could solve emotional withdrawal, that if you loved deeply enough, they would eventually feel safe enough to stay. But emotional availability is not something you can create for another person. It is something they must choose for themselves. And when someone refuses that choice again and again, their silence becomes the loudest answer you will ever receive. Not dramatic, not cruel, just consistent. And consistency tells the truth that words often hide. When someone is emotionally invested, they show up, they lean in, they stay present even when things become uncomfortable. But when someone repeatedly withdraws, avoids vulnerability, and creates distance, they are communicating something just as clearly. They are showing the limits of what they are willing to give. Understanding this changes the way you interpret everything. Their lack of effort stops feeling like a mystery. Their emotional absence stops feeling like a puzzle. It simply becomes evidence. Evidence that the connection you were trying to protect existed mostly in your willingness to hold it together. And once you see that truth, something powerful begins rising inside you. Self-respect, not the quiet kind, the unshakable kind. The kind that refuses to stay where love must constantly prove itself. Because love that is real does not require endless persuasion. It does not require emotional negotiation just to exist. It flows in both directions, naturally, freely, without someone constantly questioning whether they matter. The moment you internalize this truth, your entire energy changes. You stop shrinking your needs to make someone else comfortable. You stop apologizing for wanting consistency. You stop accepting emotional distance as if it were normal. Instead, you begin protecting your peace with the same intensity you once used to protect the relationship. And that shift is impossible for the world to ignore. Because people sense when someone knows their worth. They sense when someone is no longer willing to chase attention. They sense when someone refuses to settle for uncertainty. Your presence becomes stronger, calmer, more grounded. And ironically, this is the moment when everything begins aligning differently. Not because you forced anything to happen, but because you finally stopped forcing what was never meant to stay. The emotional space that once felt empty begins filling with something new. Confidence, clarity, a deeper understanding of what you truly deserve. And from that place, the way you connect with people changes forever. You start recognizing who shows genuine interest, who communicates openly, who moves toward connection instead of running from it. You begin choosing relationships that feel balanced instead of draining, supportive instead of confusing, steady instead of uncertain. Because once you experience the strength that comes from valuing yourself fully, there is no going back. You cannot unsee what healthy connection looks like. You cannot unknow the peace that comes from refusing emotional chaos. And most importantly, you can never again convince yourself that chasing someone who is emotionally unavailable is the same thing as love. Real love does not hide behind distance. Real love does not disappear when vulnerability appears. Real love stays. It listens. It grows stronger through honesty instead of retreat. And the moment you start believing you deserve that kind of connection, your entire life begins moving in a different direction. Not toward people who run when things get real, but toward people who stand beside you and choose to stay.